Čau všichni, moje jméno je Tim, vítejte na deník a tohle video bude úplně jiné, než to, na co jste zvyknutý. Protože se bude jednat o debatu, akorát na téma, se kterým já nesouhlasím. To znamená, že během akademických debat, respektive to, co uvidíte, se studentům přisuzuje nějaké téma, respektive nějaká strana a vy musíte to téma na té dané straně obhájit. Takže uvidíte debatu na otázku, zda International Climate Change Accords should adopt legally binding enforcement mechanisms. Pokud neumíte anglicky, tak se omlouvám, tohle video bude celé v angličtině, ale vlastně co znamená tahle věta, respektive to téma, je, že mezinárodní smlouvy o globálním oteplování, jako například Pařížská smlouva, nemají sankční mechanismy zakořeněné v té smlouvě. To znamená, že každá jedna země může po podepsání té smlouvy vystoupit bez jakýchkoliv prosekucí. Takže například Donald Trump odstoupil z Pařížské smlouvy a Biden se potom vrátil. Ale je to docela problematické, protože například pokud tam ty sankční mechanismy budete chtít dát, jako například dál protokol, tak v těchto smlouvách potom ty země jako ani v první řadě nikdy nenastoupí, jo? Že ty země nemají motivaci podepisovat smlouvu, kvůli který můžou potom platit sankční poplatky, pokud z ní vystoupíš. Jo? Takže jedná se o takovou velmi zajímavou nuanční debatu, jak by se měly některé věci měnit. Uvidíte vlastně dva týmy. Nalevo bude tým z Ameriky, který byli finalisti, a oni vlastně debatují za tu tezi, to znamená, že chtějí zavést tyto sankční mechanismy a my jsme debatovali proti na vaší pravé straně a vlastně jsme obhajovali to, že by se neměli zavést. A debata probíhá následným způsobem. První řečník odprezentuje za jednu stranu, potom první řečník za druhou, druhý řečník si to obhájí za jednu stranu a potom za druhou. Potom dochází k takzvanému křížovému výslechu, to znamená, že se týmy vzájemně ptají otázky asi 10 minut a potom se rozhodčí panelisti, který uvidíte na kameře, budou ptát otázky debatérů a debatérek a potom vlastně dochází k závěrečným řečem. Každý tým má 3 členy, vlastně ty členové jsou spolu v jednom týmu a soutěží proti sobě vlastně v té dané otázce, o které se debatuje. Takže doufám, že si video užijete a doufám, že ta angličtina nebude za tak velký problém, ale aspoň uvidíte mě debatovat v úplně jiném jazyce a v úplně jiném prostředí. Ten záznam je z roku 2018, takže se omlouvám, pokud jsem byl tehdy víc arrogantní než teď, nebo cokoliv jiného, ale snad se to užijete. Pa.
William Mason affirms the resolution. Resolved. International climate accords for greenhouse gas emissions should adopt binding enforcement mechanisms. We observe that, as explained by Ulay, enforcement mechanisms fall into 2 categories, positive and negative. The affirmative postulates that the most important and pertinent issue in the matter of climate accords is the issue of compliance, or the following of guidelines and goals. This is problematic because compliance in status quo commitments is disastrously low. Guri Bang explains, while Paris scores high on participation and reasonably high on the depth of the parties' commitments, its Achilles heel will likely be compliance. Concerning long-term effectiveness, Paris does little to restructure states' incentives so as to avoid free riding. It might end up a failure. Fortunately, Ulay explains, enforcement mechanisms should be understood as those methods by which negotiators can encourage compliance. There are 5 reasons why binding enforcement mechanisms increase compliance in climate accords. First, binding enforcement mechanisms tangibly incentivize compliance in currently non-complying nations by establishing hard incentives. In the status quo, there are no binding, tangible consequences for failing to comply with accords. The opposite is true in the affirmative world. This is important because, as Gino von Stein explains, while governments' motivations in using international inducements are diverse, the inducements themselves rely on a cost-benefit logic. Thus, in order to induce compliance, countries must feel as if there is a hard incentive to do so, something exclusive to the affirmative world. Second, binding enforcement mechanisms increase the inherent ability of states to comply in climate accords. In the status quo, some countries face structural barriers to meeting goals and guidelines. There are 2 interior warrants as to how binding enforcement mechanisms solve. First, climate accords assist poorer developing countries. Barrett explains that climate accords can create positive incentives for developing countries to participate, compensating developing countries for their compliance costs, using financing to get developing countries onto a carbon-free development path. Second, BEMs spurred the development of green technologies. Jacker of NYU furthers that in accords with enforcement mechanisms, private investors of industrialized countries finance GHG emission reduction projects in developing countries parties to the accord, receiving low carbon technology. Overall, If states are more able to comply in climate accords, they will be more likely to do so. Thirdly, binding enforcement mechanisms strengthen and promote soft incentives for compliance that exist in the status quo. Currently, the only thing that pushes compliance in the status quo is non-tangible incentives such as perception and the following of norms. There are two interior warrants as to why enforcement mechanisms reinforce and further these pre-existing incentives. First, because however poorly countries look now when not meeting climate goals, they would be looked upon even worse when they continue to non-comply when it is easier and more advantageous to do so. Second, BEMs would better allow nation-states and the general public to monitor and check on countries' progress. Plumer of the New York Times explains right now, many of Paris's pledges remain fairly opaque, and most nations have been vague on what specific policies they will take to meet them. There is no official mechanism for quantifying progress. Fourth, binding enforcement mechanisms create a culture of compliance referred to as a race to the top, which Bang defines as a, quote, snowball effect. Bang clarifies, once key countries make first steps towards cutting their emissions, others will follow suit. However, Volterra Fietta explains that in the status quo, a race to the top is skeptical due to the lack of consequences in the compliance mechanisms of the status quo, leading to the ability of countries to wiggle out of commitments. In contrast, in the affirmative world, countries are incentivized to take the first step, leading to a ratcheting effect as other countries follow. Fifth, enforcement mechanisms increase voluntary compliance. Yang explains, enforcement affirms commitment and protects the continued existence of the community for the benefit of all. Protecting and preserving normative communities can have long-term transformational benefits. If norms, interests, and identities of community members are preserved or more closely aligned with overall treaty goals and purposes, voluntary compliance will improve, and punitive corrective actions may be less necessary. The impact of compliance is massive. Compliance in climate accords is a necessity to actively mitigate climate change. Bang explains, to make a real difference for curbing climate change, agreements must achieve high compliance rates. But crucially, even if compliance isn't increased, there is intrinsic worth to the enforcement mechanisms themselves, and this is especially important. Yang explains, compliance is not the sole criterion for assessing the usefulness of traditional enforcement mechanisms. Even in domestic legal systems, the use of deterrent sanctions does not achieve perfect compliance. A complete understanding of treaty enforcement must also consider its expressive function. Yang explains two unique impacts of enforcement. First, he explains that enforcement is a necessity for the global community to set long-standing norms on the issue, as well as sending a strong signal of cooperation and moral obligation. He states, if a treaty can be seen as the expression of a consensus on norms, enforcement actions are necessary to affirm the existence of a common normative community to which all treaty parties belong. Sanctions signal disapproval and denounce the non-conforming act. They express the significance of the institution's concern with the norm violation that the other parties actually, quote, care about the treaty norms and their breach. This is critical because creating a normative community on climate change and portraying consensus on the issue is an important prerequisite to tackling this issue. There are two main impacts of creating normative communities. First, creating a consensus on the presence and impact of anthropogenic climate change solves one of the largest hindrances to global climate policy in the world today. Marcus Neild of The Guardian explains that eco-nationalist rhetoric denying climate change in key countries such as the United States, China, India, and more destroy environmental discourse on the geopolitical level. Secondly, normative communities can solve back for all negative harms because it self-cyclically removes the need for enforcement or coercion in the long term. Yang explains, protecting and preserving normative communities can have long-term transformational benefits. If norms, interests, and identities of community members are preserved or more closely aligned with overall treaty goals and purposes, voluntary compliance will improve, and punitive corrective actions may be less necessary. Secondly, Yang explains that enforcing one treaty creates a precedent that emphasizes and strengthens the rule of law and compliance in other treaties, explaining, quote, institutional deterrent sanctions strengthen the rule of law in two ways. A. They ensure that the response to a treaty violation is impartial and governed by law, and thus it is legitimate and fair. And B. They reinforce the best known manifestation of the rule of law in all treaties, the duty to comply with treaty obligations. Thus, we affirm.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll now have the opening statement from the negative team for 8 minutes.
Thank you so much. The affirmative successfully proved two things. They proved that the status quo is problematic and that compliance is important. Unfortunately for our opponent, this is not sufficient for them to win the debate, as they must show that their agreement will work as a whole, which includes attracting participation and setting strong goals. The burden of proof for the affirmative is to show why adopting binding enforcement will ensure enough compliance to succeed even with lower participation. Our burden of proof is to show that non-binding agreements are better in emission reductions because they achieve better participation despite not being perfect in achieving compliance. But before proceeding to the negative substantive, let us address few pieces of rebuttal to the affirmative model. 1. In case the non-compliant party was a major economy, sanctions will be an impossible and counterproductive measure. Smaller countries will not impose sanctions on large nations because they fear devastating economic retaliation. Thus, the largest polluters would essentially go unpunished. 2. Affirmative would presumably also use tariffs and sanctions in free trade blocs, such as the economic European area, contradicting their founding principles and taking a lot of valuable time to fight climate change. 3. The negative burden of proof is to show the exclusive benefit of non-binding accords. Hence, affirmative analysis about the importance of positive measures is not an argument for their side, because even non-binding accords can have funds for developing countries or reward nations for their successes. Thus, the only way how to reasonably assess this debate is to discuss the punitive actions which are present on the affirmative world. All in all, the affirmative cannot successfully defend this resolution if they won't clarify these issues in their next speech. Moving on to our substantive. In our substantive arguments, we will show, firstly, that non-binding accords achieve more significant participation, and secondly, that they achieve sufficient compliance of member countries. Firstly, participation. Team Affirmative completely neglected the importance of participation in this debate. The premise of this argument is that because binding accords are seen as threats to national sovereignty and their economy, countries will not sign on to them. Firstly, sovereignty. We have recently seen a rise in nationalism throughout the world with the electoral successes of populists and movements such as Brexit. Such rhetoric places an emphasis on national interest and autonomy from foreign actors. Binding agreements represent the ideal target of this rhetoric, because binding accords enable the use of negative enforcement, harming the economy and citizens of the non-compliant country. This made signing them a political suicide. Scotland, a political scientist at the University of Oslo, claims in his research that when international enforcement is perceived to be associated with sovereignty issues, it may prevent support for international enforcement. We can see that binding agreements deter participation as proven by, firstly, the non-binding Basel Convention on transboundary waste. Its participation dropped from the original 186 parties by 1/2 to only 93 parties upon adopting the legally binding ban amendment. And secondly, on another example, Montreal Protocol that adopted the legally binding Kigali Amendment, which addressed a type of greenhouse gases. The result was that the number of parties immensely decreased from 196 to only 32 parties, without the participation of US and China. Here we can see that in real world, implementing binding enforcement goals decreased participation to alarming numbers. Secondly, economy. In addition to issues with sovereignty, countries also face economic problems when joining binding agreements. Binding agreements are far more costly to implement than non-binding ones because, firstly, if a country is non-compliant, it will be punished for negative enforcement, harming the livelihoods of its citizens. Secondly, if a country is compliant, it still may have to impose sanctions in order to enforce the compliance of other countries with the accord. However, it is crucial to recognize that trade sanctions hurt both sides. Thirdly, for developed economies, staying in the accord will be extremely costly as they will have to pay for the extreme measure of positive enforcement proposed by the affirmative, no matter what economic situations they are in. All of these reasons add an economic incentive to reject the agreement, drastically harming its participation. Why is this important? Firstly, participation is crucial for the success of an agreement, as real progress in fighting climate change can only be achieved when an overwhelming majority of polluting countries agree to reduce their emissions. Secondly, participation leads to positive media attention, as agreements with more signatories draw more press attention in all countries. Positive media attention is crucial to inform society and press the establishment to fight climate change. And thirdly, China and the US. Furthermore, this debate is not only about amount of signatories, but especially the ones polluting the most. We argue that the world's two largest polluters, the United States and China, who together account for 41.19% of global emissions, are unwilling to ratify a binding accord. Christy Ashmanson of 538 writes, the US Senate and China proclaimed that they refuse to ratify any binding accord and are only willing to address climate change by voluntary means. John Cassidy from the New Yorker furthers that the only way to ensure the participation of the United States and China was to make the agreement non-binding. Given that the United States and China are enormous polluters, including them in an accord is crucial for its success. Binding accords fail to do this, thus losing out on the empirical comparative. Our second argument, compliance. Non-binding accords push nations towards meeting their commitments, as signatory countries face pressure to meet their goals, which comes from two sources. Firstly, international. Countries will use peer pressure to keep other nations accountable to the agreement because they recognize the severity of climate change. Potentially withdrawing countries are aware of the potential aggravation of international relations, exclusion from further negotiations, and loss of global leadership position. Secondly, domestic. Hovey and Scotland suggest domestic pressure from NGOs and civil society will compel governments of non-binding accords to remain compliant. Hence, even if a national government decides to withdraw from an agreement, civil society pushes local governments to uphold environmental regulations, as was the case when President Trump decided to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement, which sparked a response among local governments, forming the Chicago Climate Charter, a 67-city pact to fight climate change. To conclude, the peer pressure will therefore be effective as an enforcement mechanism, yet it will not deter countries from participating, as on comparative binding enforcement would. Even if, having the less compliance, the respective reduction commitments under non-binding accords are more ambitious. To avoid punishment, countries set the goals as low as possible in binding accords, ensuring that they meet them even without significant effort. As Fergus Green of LSE says, stronger bindingness in climate agreements has a strongly depressive effect on the ambition of key emitters. Conversely, as indicated by Henning Bang from the University of Oslo, in non-binding accords, countries can strive towards more stringent goals without fearing the consequence of failure. In conclusion, the negatives showed you first that binding enforcement deters participation, and second, that non-binding enforcement ensures significant compliance.
Thank you very much. Second speeches will begin with the affirmative, and you may start when you're ready.
First off, a couple of key observations on how we want to frame the round. First of all, on what adoption means. We would contend that adoption, a prerequisite to adoption, is an existing legally binding climate agreement. This is really important. We contend that the negative world is one where there is a legally binding agreement without enforcement and binding enforcement mechanisms, and we contend that the affirmative one is where where enforcement mechanisms are added or adopted. Second of all, we observe that when you're weighing the impacts in the round, you will always prefer compliance to participation. This is because, first of all, compliance is what directly leads to tangible impacts. Complying with environmental agreements is what takes emissions out of the air. It's what creates actual positive good. But secondly, and more importantly, we would contend that participating without complying across the board is not only ineffective because it doesn't tangibly reduce emissions, but more problematically, it presents a hollow hope that we are taking effective steps to climate change when in reality, we are not. We would contend that that is even worse. But then, third, we would say that every sliding scale step that you take towards less emissions is good, period. That's really important because if we reduce emissions at all, that's good. It doesn't matter if they also reduce emissions. If we reduce emissions more, that's even better because at the end of the day, we would contend that climate change is such a big issue that the status quo is not working well enough. We need to try as much as possible to mitigate emissions in order to prevent the massive negative impacts of climate change. With that, let's go into their three observations. First of all, they talk about sanctions against larger countries. Two things. First, we would contend that although in the status quo it's unlikely for a country like the United States to be sanctioned by the rest of the world, when you have something with as much political clout as a climate change agreement with binding enforcement mechanisms, that changes. That's because it's not the United States versus a particular country, it's the rest of the world versus the United States. The rest of the world is still a much larger trading bloc. But then, second, when they make this EU argument saying that the EU is a block of trade, the EU also has shared tradable permit programs right now, so the EU would enter agreements as a bloc. This is not relevant. But third, when they talk about positive measures not being topical, they don't really warrant this. We would contend, as Ulay explains, that at the end of the day, any part of an agreement that incentivizes compliance is an enforcement mechanism. If you get money for complying with something, that law is being enforced, or if you're not having money taken away from you, that law is equally being enforced. With that, let's get into their first argument about participation. They make two warrants about sovereignty and economic harms. You can group both of these together because all of their examples talk about legally binding agreements. This is really important. What they're talking about is the addition of legally binding the addition of a legally binding clause being damaging to sovereignty and like having economic harms. What we're saying is we add enforcement mechanisms. The difference is crucial because it's political suicide for a country to have to ratify a treaty as legally binding. That's the infringement of sovereignty. It is not political suicide to add enforcement mechanisms to an already legally binding treaty like Paris is. Paris was already signed. We bite the harms, they've already occurred. But second, on economic harms. First of all, we would contend that at the end of the day, the economic harms of actual climate change are substantially worse. But second of all, that any trade sanctions, any economic impacts of trade sanctions that are happen would most likely not manifest in most scenarios. That's because they are strongly deterrent. That's the point of incentives. Sure, some people break the law and some people pay speeding tickets, but not everyone has to fear a $100 speeding ticket every time they drive. At the end of the day, most people are incurring the economic harms because sanctions are acting as a deterrent effect. But then third, they talk about developing countries footing the bill. We would contend that this is a good thing. This goes back to the end of our own case where we talk about the equal applicability of the rule of law. We would say that right now, developing nations both disproportionately bite the impact and disproportionately bite the blame for current climate environmental accords. We would say that larger countries need to do more to foot the bill. They're saying that larger countries won't join. The reason why this is important is because the definition at the top explains that we are adopting enforcement mechanisms into an already existing climate agreement. That means countries like the United States have to walk away from the table, not join in the first place. This is a really important distinction because the political loss of walking away from the table, of saying I don't want progress, is a lot more significant than not joining up with an agreement in the first place. That's why the United States leaving Paris was such a massive deal, but the United States failing to comply with Paris flew under the radar year after year. Then they talk about China and the United States. First of all, on the United States is already not part of Paris. We would contend that the reason why is Trump was scared of like parity in the agreement. He wanted more countries to comply, so we saw for that. But second, on China, we would say if China is going to comply in either world, they're going to comply. But if they're going to comply, they would rather reap the positive benefits of being part of the agreement. Essentially, if you're going to comply, you might as well be part of the agreement. If you're not going to comply, you're not going to comply, and you're going to take the hit. Then, on their second point about compliance, both the international peer pressure and the domestic pressure exist in both worlds. This is really important. We're adding binding enforcement mechanisms on top of already existing peer pressure, which means we only increase compliance. That is the entirety of the affirmative case. For those reasons, we proudly stand in affirmation.
Thank you.
Kyoto Agreement was ratified by 45 countries, while Paris by 197. We agree with the affirmative team that compliance is important, but when numbers are there is such a big difference in numbers, we think that participation and the amount of countries which sign is also something which should not be neglected. What am I going to do in my speech are a few things. So first of all, clarify what this debate is about, because there was general misconception of how two teams debate this one, and then we'll look into two areas of clash. I will talk about which side has better participation, and secondly, which side has better compliance, later on comparing the two worlds. Let's start with clarity. I would like to emphasize, first of all, what are the burdens of proof in this debate. Both sides need to prove what are the exclusive benefits of both agreements. So proposition have to show why binding agreements are good, and we have to show why non-binding ones. That is to say, the argument about that we need positive enforcement mechanisms is not sufficient in this debate, because simply even Paris Agreement or non-binding accords have these measures as well. Hence, this is what the debate should be primarily about.
That is to say, next thing is about criteria of this debate. We think that this debate, for you to be judged, is about the trade-off between compliance and participation. Because generally, in binding accords, there is lower rate of participation because countries are deterrent, while we agree and take on the burden of the fact that having non-binding agreements means that there is lower rate of compliance. We have to compare these two, and this is the reason why we believe we should win the debate. Let's start with participation as such. We talked about two things in our first speech. That is to say, sovereignty and impact on the economy. We explained how it's important to recognize the severity of the status quo. That is to say, rise of nationalist movements such as Brexit and all around the world. And the second argument was about the economy. And here it is really important to understand that what the second speaker of the proposition explained wasn't sufficient to this debate. Because they talked about, climate change is important, but economy is less than it. Academically, that's completely correct. But that's not how people perceive agreements. That is not how people perceive sovereignty. People in the world, or average Joe, simply cares about the fact if his country is dependent on others or not. That's the reason why in most European countries, and even in Slovakia, we simply see a rise of populist movements. With that, we need to elaborate. So there are three reasons why we win on participation. First of all, because we explicitly explained that the United States and China will simply never ratify any binding agreement. They said that the United States Senate has to ratify these agreements, and they explicitly said that this is not the case. Why? Let's analyze it more deeply. Because simply, you want to tackle climate change, but you don't want to do that by looking as a vulnerable person who is willing to agree to commitments of other individuals. That is to say, we believe that countries are willing to fight against climate change, but not when they are forced to do something. They need to have voluntary measures, which we think is something on our side of the house. Second thing, we also see it is pretty weird that team opposition completely neglected all our evidence. We talked about how Basel Convention had over 100 parties, but later when adopting the ban amendment, which was binding, the participation dropped by half. We also talked about the Montreal Protocol, which was like, yes, shortly binding, but when adopting a really harsh Kigali amendment, simply again decreased to only 30-something parties. We can see that these are numbers which are significant in this debate. It's not like one or two countries. That is to say, participation falls on our side. The affirmative tried to draw your eyes into the compliance. So let me deal with that as well. Compliance. We see that compliance works on our side as well. They talked about international pressure. They talked about how there is domestic pressure by communities. But this is, again, something we have on our side as well. If people care about climate change, they will push it no matter if it's binding agreement or a non-binding one, right? This is the reason why we use the evidence of Chicago Amendment after Donald Trump withdrew from Paris Agreement, because we can simply see that even in non-binding accords where people leave, we have domestic and civil society who pushes these countries to do something. Hence, there is not a big marginal difference between the two worlds. Now, affirmative try to actually say that the unique benefits of theirs is the issue of sanctions. There are three reasons why sanctions are simply a bad mechanism as such. First, when big countries leave, no one can do anything. So China and United States left from Kyoto Agreement when it adopted the binding enforcement. And guess what? No one did anything because no one is able and willing to impose sanctions on these big players. Secondly, we talked about how it's problematic on free trade blocks areas. So Slovakia and other countries which have populist people, they simply do you think that it's proper to punish the whole European Union for a mistake of one country? We think that this is generally immoral as such. With that, we're able to show why generally on our side of the house we even have sufficient level of compliance compared to participation. Lastly, let's compare these two trade-offs, because we think that in our side of the house we not only have better participation, but also why participation is better. Because with more countries participating, we have media coverage. We have more media who talk about more countries being there. But even on top of that, agreements such as Paris Agreement don't have a negative media influence because they don't infringe on sovereignty of people. That is to say, people know that climate change is important and good to fighting against it only when there is non-binding. For all these reasons, don't forget that participation is something we need to uphold.
Okay, we'll start interactive part of the debate now, beginning with about 12 minutes of the teams asking questions of each other and exclusively, and then following that, the panel will be able to direct questions to the teams. So for the next 12 minutes or so, we'll have questions from one team to the other and bounce those back and forth as best we can. So let's start with an affirmative question for the negative team.
All right, is the Kigali Amendment you're talking about the one that was signed on October 15th in regards to HFCs?
Yes.
Okay, well, we have evidence from the EPA that says 197 countries adopted an amendment to phase down the HFCs when it came to Kigali. So how can you say only like 80 countries ratified it?
Well, we tell you that that's not the case. We don't have that many parties ratifying it. And we tell you that even the greatest polluters such as the United States and China are not part of it.
Okay, I think it's your question.
Question for the negative to the affirmative.
How would you include binding enforcement into existing accords? Would you subject countries to punishments they have not consented to?
Okay, so what we would say is the affirmative is a question of what we should do. So when you're asking, should we how can we add enforcement mechanisms if they haven't agreed to it before? What we're saying is when we're looking at what we can do today, we're asking whether that is a good or a bad thing. We don't have to defend a complete renegotiation of a treaty, even if countries didn't agree to it in the past. We're looking at whether that adoption is a good or a bad thing. Now, if you want to say that the adoption today is a bad thing because countries will be angry because they didn't agree to it in hindsight, that's an argument you can make, but what we would contend is that's what the scope of the debate falls to.
Question from the affirmative to the negative.
Okay, so when you discuss the idea of legally binding agreements versus binding enforcement agreements, are you guys defending an agreement that is legally binding, has enforcement mechanisms, or both? Can you just clarify that?
So we recognize the distinction between these exists. Nonetheless, to be very, very clear, so we generally oppose agreements which are enforced. That is to say, we will never use sanctions against countries which simply sign into agreement. But comparatively, legally binding accords where you simply have to ratify that by Congress, we think that these are fine with us. But generally, the question is about sanctions and generally these kind of stuff.
Question from the negative to the affirmative.
I'll continue. So again and again, the United States Congress has said it will not ratify any global climate deal which restrains United States action. Why do you expect them to ratify a binding agreement in your case?
Okay, so a couple of problems here. First of all, in the status quo, the United States is already non-participating. So the only thing we can do is make it better. Second of all, since you can see that they're a key player, right, we can't vote negative there face off. But thirdly, more importantly, we'd argue that when you create tangible incentives, right, when you create a global consensus within the nation state about the importance of climate change, which is what our evidence that you failed to address in your second speech does, we specifically allow for the people that are electing these congressmen and for the popular consensus in the United States to change fundamentally. Thirdly, more importantly, we'd argue that the reason people aren't passing climate change is partisan issues and whether they believe climate change is anthropogenic or not. We also solve back from that in case and evidence that you failed to respond to. So those are three main reasons why we would pass in our world while you definitely don't participate in yours.
Question from the affirmative to the negative.
So this is going to be related to the same issue we were talking about. If you concede in your constructive that having the United States and China as part of a climate accord is absolutely necessary, shouldn't we vote AF on face because the United States is not participating in the negative world?
Okay, so we can see that the United States right now would not participate in any accord on both sides of this house. However, what we are telling you is that because of the procedure of ratifying treaties by the United States Senate, the United States will not be a party in binding agreements even in the future. However, it will be a party of non-binding treaties on our side once the current administration is replaced.
Question from the negative to the affirmative.
So I'll continue. You explained how you would add these binding mechanisms into already existing agreements. However, we can see that this is not how how international law works. That we can only punish countries when they consent to the punishment themselves. How can you address this problem of having to add an amendment which countries have to sign again and ratify again with the binding enforcement mechanisms into the existing treaties?
I mean, first of all, on some level, I would argue the affirmative gets some sort of fiat in the debate, because if the resolution states that we should adopt binding climate enforcement mechanisms, if the argument you're making is that that would be impossible, that's one argument. But we're saying that on some level, those have to be able to be passed. But secondly, we'd argue that the role of the affirmative ballot is just to prove that if we adopted BEMs today, when we cast the AF ballot, will it be good or will it be bad? We'd argue that that's the scope of the debate that we're debating today. If you guys want to make an argument about that, you should feel free to do that in your next speech.
Question?
Question from the affirmative to the negative.
Okay, so you talk about the idea of participation and compliance. At what point of compliance does participation become relevant? Or rather, where is the trade-off? How many countries do you need to prove that leave for compliance to become a non-issue on our side?
I gladly take that. Thank you for the question. Basically, we firstly say that we need to have participation in order to have compliance, and that's essentially the response to your question. We firstly have the countries to participate in, and then build up on it afterwards.
Finally, one more negative question to the affirmative.
So to the idea about what is the phrasing of the motion, you talk about how this debate is about should or not should do that. We agree, but isn't the debate also about practical and technical issues of a policy debate where you have to explain how certain things works in practice? You never showed us why is it how is it possible to simply put sanctions on a country which only ratified a non-binding agreement? Can you elaborate on that?
All right, so at a certain point, we'd argue that we are advocating for the most feasible approach for the affirmative side of this debate. So at the point where we're talking about binding enforcement mechanisms on the affirmative side, we're going to choose the most practical approach, which is the approach that we favor.
Okay. Welcome to the part of the program that everybody who's ever been in this debate remembers vividly or has nightmares about. Either one. Take your pick. But we will now take questions from the panel. Who would like to start?
So I'll start by trying to set some common ground for me. I hope it'll be common ground for you. So I'm going to make an assumption. I'm going to tell a story here for about 30 seconds based on that assumption, and then I'm going to want each team to comment on anything you think I got wrong. So I take it, this is my assumption, that both of you think that the norm for my ballot should be the results that are achieved in terms of positively affecting the climate by each of the competing proposals. Now, if that's correct, that's my assumption, that you want results, okay, then it's a question of a three-part formula. A times B equals C, A being the amount of result that would be produced by compliant activity by an actor, times B, the number of actors that comply, and that equals C, the total amount of reduction that we get. So I would then think that I have to weigh, in judging each of the proposals, and this should be what disposes my ballot, what I think the weight of each of those A's is, and the number of A's there'll be in B. Do I have anything wrong? Do you want to give me different guidance for how I should vote? I'm asking that of both teams.
Well, we start with the affirmative.
So, sorry, I'm a bit close, but so we would argue that, first of all, yes, absolutely, we're intent on evaluating the rounds based on the ends that occur, but secondly, a little important clarification, we have ends that occur inside or constructive outside of the realm of just the climate, and definitely that we're going to be going for in our final speech. Specifically, the last argument in our constructive explains why enforcement has intrinsic value, because when one international accord or treaty is enforced, that leads to an effect where other international law is respected. That's going to be really, really important. In fact, we're going to argue that is the most important issue when you write your ballot today, because the odds either of us solve climate change, pretty low. We're going to argue that we have a higher probability, but it's pretty low. The odds that we see a rights violation occurring in the next 5 or 10 years where a country violates their own citizens' rights or violates international law or sanctions in a poor manner, that's what happens when countries don't respect the rule of law. That's the most important impact in the round. That's the most probable, excuse me.
So just to ask a follow-up quickly, and then I'm going to try to keep quiet for the rest. So you're saying that you haven't introduced your strongest argument just yet. You've implied it. And it's going to be the argument that there are these collateral advantages that enhance the rule of law.
Yeah, we had the argument, we had the evidence, the card at the very bottom of our constructive.
No, I took notes, and I noted that you hadn't, but more to come, in other words.
Absolutely. We got a lot coming.
All that you've done up to now shouldn't determine my ballot, but you're going to add some other consequence.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay.
Negative. You'll answer Dr.
So, first of all, thank you for the clarification. Maybe like 3 pieces of response. First of all, we believe that we agree that it's about like A times B, so participation and how many countries and how much they do, and that is to say.
Don't forget A prime.
Yeah, I'll get to it in third later. So, given that, we think that we might agree with Team Affirmative that compliance on their side is extremely strong because they simply have extremely sanctions. That's something we're fine with admitting. But because we were able to show you that sanctions actually deter countries from signing in the first place, means that the A part, or the B one, yeah, the A one is actually stronger on our side. That's the first one. And the second one, I would like to emphasize that we also talked in the first speech that given that the motion talks about climate change as such, we also think that media attention and how people perceive the agreement is also important, right? So when you think that the agreement is like bad and takes away your rights, this is the point when you will never vote for a good government. And also, third one, we just want to clarify that if an argument like the most important one comes in the last speech, which we cannot address, we just don't see how good it is in the context of the debate, because we cannot respond to it.
Next question. Okay.
Now you get a real expert.
For the affirmative, enforcement is desirable, but is it practical? I'm reminded that when Stalin was asked about the Pope, he said, "The Pope, how many divisions does he have?" How, in your mind, would an enforceable treaty be enforced?
So we would say at the end of the day, first of all, that like the enforcement mechanisms that would be put in place would be similar to most international accords, just be enforced by the preponderance of countries. Now, in the context of how often will that take action, as they point out, there's scenarios where that may not be as effective as possible. But what we would also contend is that when we put enforcement mechanisms in place, they also have a very expressive signal that's really important for like how people approach climate change agreements in the future. And we talk about this both in like our first speech and our second speech when we discuss how like when we talk about the discussion of participation and compliance, when everyone participates but no one complies, it creates a hollow hope, first of all. And second of all, when they talk about the idea of like media discourse, we would say a scenario where everyone seems less committed, that's a scenario where there's less respect for like environmental law in general. So we would say two things. First, that yes, enforcement will happen in some scenarios, but there will be some shortcomings. But second of all, we bridge the more fundamental gaps for why climate policy isn't pushed, which is like total respect for like the importance of climate law in general.
And for the negative, if you have a non-binding, in the sense of enforcement treaty, how would you envision encouraging or reaching high levels of compliance with that treaty?
So to clarify, we don't claim that we have a higher level of compliance than the affirmative does. This debate is structured in a way that they automatically gain more compliance just because they have stringent measures on their side, whereas we get more participation. What we are claiming is that we have sufficient compliance to keep most countries in the agreement and keep them to reach their goals. And what we are also claiming is that the A part, the participation, is much wider on our side. So even if all of those countries do not comply, the overall emissions reductions are much higher on our side because we achieve greater participation.
I would just quickly add to the point about compliance. We don't think that it's inherently already lost on our side, but to specifically address your question, we have international pressure and a domestic one, which works on our side as well. So that is to say, despite not having sanctions, we think that these two are sufficient for our side to win the debate. Thanks.
Next question. Okay, Mr. Lupo?
I'm trying to understand what, in the sort of vein of the A times B equals C, what compliance with what are we evaluating those multiples by? You've not talked about a specific treaty or standard or goal when you discussed the difference between compliance and non-compliance. Is there a norm that you think exists for either reduction target or behavior of a country that is considered compliant?
So in the status quo, we'd argue that the most widespread, critically acclaimed climate accord that exists in the negative world is going to be the Paris Accord. So within the Paris Accord, there is no objective. In fact, they have NDCs, so countries can set their own targets. There's no objective one standard that all countries must adhere to. But we'd argue compliance has intrinsic value because it's not just about you getting to one number, but rather you getting to your number. When you sign on a piece of paper, you may be participating, but you are not complying. We look at the A times B scenario that Mr. Sexton brings up. Hande is the math guy in our team, but I know that when A equals 0 and you're multiplying by B, your answer is still 0, because it doesn't matter how much participation you have. When there's no compliance, compliance being when you meet the goals that you signed up to meet for, you're not getting any impact. That final number and that final value is 0.
Jean-Paul? You wanna direct it? Okay.
Yeah, and a quick question for the negative. I want to understand the value of participation absent compliance. It seems like you're making a concession, or you just made a concession earlier in cross-examination that the affirmative team would increase compliance, meaning there are lots of participants in your world who are not complying. What is the value of participation if you're admitting they're not actually reducing their emissions or meeting targets?
Yep. So, I would say that this debate comes up to one big clash, and that is it better to have, let's say, random number, 200 countries which do some kind of a job because they are compliant sufficiently, or when you have, let's say, 50 to 70 countries who are participating, but they're actually doing their stuff. With that in mind, we think that, yes, we have lower compliance. That is given by the motion. Simply sanctions are strong compliant. That is something which we cannot argue against. But what we are claiming is that the compliance on our side is sufficient, but because the participation is so high, it is different. With that in mind, the intrinsic, the unique value of participation is exactly because of the media attention, is about how people perceive it, but also the fact that you can deal with more countries, you're able to get more goals, more concessions, more negotiations. Therefore, more countries is generally also a benefit in itself.
Thank you.
Can I add on that?
Mr. Baker?
I was going to ask a question to the bearer, but it got demoted down from the table to the floor. So I'm going to skip that for now and just kind of follow up where Mr. Lupo was, which is I'm not really totally with this explanation of the creation of compliance versus participation. I've invited a bunch of people over to my house to work, and when it's 20 or 30, they don't get much more done than 3. So I guess what I want to understand is, in the world where you have more participation and therefore get more concessions or more compliance or more adherence, is there any empirical example that you can point to in a non-binding context where that's actually happened, where we've had more people involved, and as a result, yippee, we've gotten more stuff done?
Okay, so this is a slightly different situation than people working on a house together, because here everyone
I'm glad.
Because here everyone has their own emission reduction targets to achieve. So every country is doing something on their own, and what we are doing is adding up the benefit from all those. So the value of having more participants is that even if not everyone does all of their job, we get more done in total. And to the empirical part, we believe that the Paris Agreement, while it is not perfect because we can see withdrawals, still achieved far more in terms of emission reductions than the Kyoto Protocol, which only had about 40 nations participating and had extremely low limits, which is again something that we achieve on our side because countries are not afraid they can set higher limits for themselves. So when we compare these two protocols, we can see that the Paris is far more successful.
Let me ask you a little bit of a follow-up related to that then. In that world, does that assume that the larger number of polluters, for example, if the top 10 were active, that's the same as the amount of pollution or control that would exist for the next 30 or so? Because there seems to be an implicit relationship between the level of involvement and how much they're contributing to the problem. I just want to understand how those things interact.
So thank you for your question. We would just like to point out the fact that basically what we are speaking is not just about numbers, not about just quantity of the states that are within the agreement, but especially about how much emissions do they produce. And what we are saying is that we have something exclusive that is basically participation of the United States and China, which on the other side of the house at this current point, it simply isn't the case.
And I just a quick question for the AF, which is, I'm going to go back to this enforcement question, because I think you all have given 5 answers to it, but I still don't have any idea how you all are actually enforcing anything. So let's try this again. I understand that you don't have to necessarily defend enforcement. I understand that you all feel that you're defending a shared resolution. Get all that, okay? But in the world that, let's say, JP and I were hanging out later on, we were trying to figure out, how would you actually enforce and add something? Can someone give us an answer to the question of how you would actually enforce it, like what a mechanism of that would be? I'm not changing your defense of the resolution, but want to understand what that practically looks like to understand how it's possible.
Okay, so to answer your question in short, the mechanism by which people comply is twofold. positive and negative enforcement mechanisms. The negative ones are sanctions, which make countries comply because they don't want to get hit with the sanction. And the positive one is we give countries money so they can have easier development to comply with their NDC. So when a country sets their own goal and then complies, they get the positive sanctions. When a country sets their own goal and doesn't comply with their own goal, they get hit with the negative sanction.
Right, and your argument is that we could add those, after the fact, and that's what you're defending, correct?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, in short.
Next question. Mr. Houston.
I want to follow up with some of the same vein of questioning here and everything. I think addresses to the negative first. It seems to make a difference that you are talking about participation and compliance, and you use the whole, 200 countries are participating or whatever, and then only 50 of them are complying or whatever it is. And you even seem to say that the United States and China are the key to that, okay? How then, in your world, do you get a country or one of those two countries when it seems their government and their administration is not necessarily wishing to comply? How do you get them to comply? I mean, how do you get them to come to the party or help Will with his house,
Yeah, so again, let's make it extremely clear. If there is a country, let's say the Trump administration right now, who doesn't want to sign neither binding accords nor non-binding ones, then this administration simply goes far away from the debate because none of the sides can win this one. But what we are saying in the end is that in this instance, we basically can provide more of this kind of enforcement. That is to say, we have international pressure and we have a domestic one. And we think that these two are good because they still contain voluntary mechanisms rather than sanctions which infringe on sovereignty, which people care so much. So that is to say, one, we have the China polluter, but secondly, in the long run, and also especially in case of in previous administrations of the United States, binding and non-binding agreements are better because in the end, people can actually go into them in the first place.
But earlier in the debate, you began to talk about, when you try to look at sovereignty and then the economy, right? You put those two side by side. Weren't you telling us, though, that the economy was much more important in people's mind than sovereignty?
No. Sorry. If there is a misconfusion, we were saying
Okay.
that we agree that climate change is extremely important aspect in academics in the real world. But what people care actually more in general is economy and two, compliance. They care about them because this is something which actually has a short-term effect on them because you literally either take away their rights or their money. And that is to say, an agreement which tackles climate change is a good one. But once they infringe on one of these two, is this the one which actually they will not prioritize? That is to say, this is the difference between the two worlds.
David, would you like to direct the same question to the affirmative? Or
Yeah,
a
I
similar
think,
one?
well, yeah, and I think the same vein and everything, I think one of the major points that you seem to be wanting to make is that, that for want of a better term, peer pressure, that you're going to create mechanisms that are going to cause countries to go ahead and comply with this. If again, the two major, people that are the two major countries that are the ones that don't comply are the United States and China. How do you get them to comply? What peers are going to pressure them to do that?
Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, we would contend, as I mentioned in my speech, that the one of the main reasons that the United States dropped out of Paris was a lack of parity. They felt that there weren't commitments across the board, so we think we would solve for that participation. But on the general compliance participation debate, what we would contend is that there's some scenarios where, say, take China for example, they might not ever want to submit to that level of sovereignty loss where they wouldn't have a BEM. We are saying that the level of compliance that they do right now, with Paris in place, all that peer pressure, all of that still exists in their world, or in our world, if they choose not to be a party to an accord. So really what this debate should come down to is their side is 195 countries and none of them do anything. Then our side is maybe 50, maybe 70 countries who all have high compliance rates. Then there are some countries outside of the agreement who will never do anything in either world because they'll take the hit no matter what. They're right, we can't solve that. But the third party are countries who they're not part of the agreement because of the sovereignty or economic hits or whatever, but they're still complying because they're complying right now. Essentially what we would say is compliance exists independent of both, or what we would say is countries who choose not to join in their arguments when they say that countries will drop out, those countries who drop out won't simply choose to start emitting a law just out of spite. That's what we're saying.
Okay. Christina?
I have two separate questions. The first is for the affirmative. If their empirical evidence is indicative of what happens when binding enforcement mechanisms are added, which seems like a drop. They've given two examples of a drop in numbers. It also seems like participation is a prerequisite to compliance. So how would you be a step in the right direction if you actively undermine participation?
So to clarify again, as Otne explained in our second speech, both of the examples, the empirical examples they talked about, as they themselves stated uncontestedly, these are legally binding accords, not accords with binding enforcement mechanisms. These are two fundamentally different things. This is why they're not getting access to their impacts on participation, because legally binding accords happens when you sign onto the paper. Paris, for example, is legally binding. You are bound to do certain things. What a binding enforcement mechanism does is it punishes you 100% for sure if you don't do those things. Legally binding accords are their world. They exist in the negative status quo. Binding enforcement mechanisms exist in our world. If anything, this turns their argument our way, because they're saying in status quo agreements, which are legally binding, people aren't being compliant. People aren't participating. So, and secondarily, even if we don't want to buy any of that, even if we want to say participation goes down for sure, we would argue that participation without compliance is essentially meaningless. If you just sign onto an accord and you never take any action, you're not getting anything done. The time for words has passed. The time for deeds has begun. Even if we don't have a lot of countries participating, if some comply, we are moving in the right direction.
And you had a question to negative?
And a question for the negative. It seems like if we assume the affirmative's framing of the debate, which is magically BEMs are added to existing agreements, then it seems like if that would have been true and Obama would have signed something that was actually binding, then Trump would not have been able to get out. Why is that not an argument for the F?
Yeah, so thank you very much. There is a very clear response to that. There will never, ever be a Paris Agreement which is legally enforced signed by United States, because Senate will simply not push it away, right? We believe that it will be, we agree, in an ideal world, it would be great if there would be binding agreements and everyone would sign to them and never leave. But that's not simply the case. Countries don't want to do that, and this is the reason why Paris Agreement wouldn't be possible to have the United States at the same time and on the other side having that. Moreover, maybe also to respond to what the affirmative says and maybe make it even more clear, we're not saying that all countries participating will do nothing. That's a complete lie. We're saying they will do sufficient amount of job, but comparatively they will generally produce more outcome, that is to say C, rather than when you have completely zero, lower rate of participation.
Okay. So we all agree that the debate, the winner of the debate is the team that makes the best case for either BEMs increasing the likelihood of a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions versus essentially the status quo. Is that the debate?
Okay, so we have that component of the debate, but we uniquely as the affirmative read at the very bottom of our case that not only do we solve for greenhouse gas emissions, but we also solve for the fact that international law and the status quo, a lot of countries don't comply. But when we pass binding enforcement mechanisms, more countries will comply with other international law and other international treaties.
Okay, but just so we're clear, because at least theoretically, you want my ballot.
Yeah.
So
we'd like it in reality too.
You know, so
he's always in the minority.
Well, now, David, how does he know that?
I didn't tell him. I'll throw Andrea under the bus.
All right, Andrew. No. So in the next speech, just so it's clear, I'm looking for evidence from either side that will indicate that adding binding enforcement mechanisms to greenhouse gas emission accords will actually achieve a more significant reduction than the status quo? Because I take it, and this is a question of the affirmative, you've agreed that adding BEMs will reduce participation. That's a yes or a no?
We're going to give you a maybe, even though you won't like that. Because here's the argument we're going to make. We're going to say that there is a possibility.
Well, do you disagree with their evidence?
I mean, we disagree with the evidence they provided on participation decrease. Yes, we claim that it's, as they claim, legally binding,
what
not a binding
evidence
enforcement mechanism.
can you do it now or just put it in your next speech? What evidence do you have that adding BEMs to those types of accords will either not decrease participation or, perhaps stated differently, will actually achieve greater reductions?
For example, one accord with BEMs that did not have a large loss in participation, in fact had pretty high participation, was the Montreal Accords, which in fact went on to achieve their goals of CFC elimination.
And the Montreal Accords had binding enforcement mechanisms?
Yes, they had both positive and negative mechanisms and did not see the loss in participation my opponents insinuate will happen.
Okay. Negative? What do you say about that?
So I would actually have 4 responses to this. Firstly, briefly about the Montreal...
Get my pen out. All right, go ahead.
Firstly, about the Montreal Protocol. Well, firstly, this was not a climate change protocol. It regarded the ozone depletion, which is a different issue, and it is an issue which is much cheaper to solve. That was the reason for its success. Now, secondly, we agree with you that this debate is about reducing emissions.
So you say that experience in that accord is not relevant?
Yes, we say that it is not relevant for this debate.
All right, what else?
Secondly, we agree with you that this debate is about reducing emissions. However, we tell you that it is about reducing emissions in the real world, in the world we live in. It is not about this magic world where we can simply impose BMs onto a country. It is in this world where countries have to have to sign onto international legal obligations. Now, the third point is that they would give you these unique benefits of binding enforcement, which lie outside of climate change. Yet we tell you that this debate is fundamentally about climate change and about achieving it. Even if it wasn't, we still have unique benefits of media attention that we explained to you in our first speech. So this is not the point that should decide this debate. And fourth, just a brief clarification. It is not necessarily about altering the status quo, because in the status quo we already have binding and non-binding accords as well. We gave you the example of the Kyoto Protocol, which was a binding, which was a protocol with binding enforcement that regarded climate change, yet it failed. We compared this with Paris, which was a non-binding protocol that was far more successful. So it is about comparing these two types of accords going into the future.
So with permission? Of course. So first of all, I want to make it very, very clear that as the dean of Bill Brewer's law school, we're very, very proud of him. And as someone that's known him since he was your age and a debater, he hasn't lost it. So be careful. You may want his ballot because this may be the year he ends up in the majority. but whether or not you want my ballot, I don't know. But my formula has gotten more clear to me now, and I just want to give you an opportunity to respond to where I am now with regard to my ballot. So now for me it's become about this. Neither of you have talked explicitly, but each of you has talked implicitly about a new noun I'm going to introduce, which is targets. So if I were to summarize your argument, I think that the negative claims, and here, by the way, I'm going to anticipate, because I have a PhD in religion, the secret argument you're going to bring up in a few minutes, okay? Which is that outside of this, there's going to be all this behavior that people are going to be, all kinds of norms that, you know, on human rights, on a whole range of issues that have nothing to do with climate change, but just because people are going to see that the rule of law is good. Okay,
you
now,
have a
as the former
doctorate
dean,
in
as the
psychic
former
as well.
dean of a law school as well as a theologian, I'm going to tell you that sounds an awful lot like an argument lawyers would make. And there's this other argument over here by people that don't feel law is necessary to make the world work in a moral way, and that would say voluntary compliance is even better. And it's going to come down in this narrow proposition to the following. They say, now this is the word target, if you allow people to set their own voluntary targets, they're more likely to come to the table, and they're more likely to set high targets, and the aggregate result that Bill Brewer is going to get will be X. And they would say, by adding the necessity, whether you do it ex ante or ex post, okay, because that gets into a question of what countries can do in modifying treaties. But adding the BEMs, what you're going to do is you're going to have people set the bar lower, and even with the bar lower, you're going to have fewer people involved, and that formula is going to produce an aggregate that is some number less than X. Now, I think that's the way the debate crystallizes. You've got to prove that the targets are going to be high enough by the people that will come in. They've got to prove they're going to get higher targets and more people in to get the higher aggregate number. And then we're going to add whatever we want in this legal versus moral debate that you're going to create. And I'll just close by quoting Daniel Berrigan, who read to me once from a letter from Thomas Merton, in which Merton, a week before his death, said, "When the head of state presses the button that sends into the air the missile that destroys the world, it will be a legal act." So much for the relationship of morality and law.
Why don't you have the affirmative respond to that? I told you you'd never forget it. Let's give you a minute, and then the negative can follow that, and then we will, unless there's other questions, we will move to our final two rebuttal speeches, which are much anticipated, I think. So, affirmative for a minute.
So when you talk about the idea of setting our own targets, and we talk about the NDCs that exist in both worlds, the affirmative is going to continue to make the argument that in the status quo, yes, we may have ambitious goals, but the key word is ambitious, because it's not just that they're not being reached, it's that people aren't even trying. This is a fundamental problem in the status quo, because we have reached a scenario in which everyone in this room, or probably everyone in this room, or at least the four of us up here, can agree that the climate accords that we have right now and the climate progress we're making right now is not good enough. That's why we're having this debate, because we are not making the progress that we need to have. So it doesn't matter how high their goals are, if they are not only not reaching for the bar, they are not even trying to reach for the bar. So we say if we lower the bar and that leads to them making an effort, that is net good, that is intrinsic good, and yeah, we're going to be making that rule of law argument at the end. So.
Okay, affirmative? Yep. Negative, I apologize.
So I would like to start.
This is your 1 minute answer. This isn't the rebuttal speech.
Oh, yeah, no.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. I would like to emphasize the evidence we provided even in the first speech, which was completely ignored. That is, as Fergus Green from the LSC says, quote, "Stronger bindingness in climate agreement has a strongly depressive effects on the ambition of key emitters," unquote. That is to say, in the affirmative world, you still have negotiations. Countries have power to decide what is good for them or not. When they are they're fearing that once they will simply not be able to do to fulfill the goals, they will generally sell the bar low. Now, affirmative still continues and explains how status quo is so bad, how we are all dying and stuff. But ladies and gentlemen, this debate is not about that we have to defend status quo. This debate is about choosing which agreement or which mechanism, which already exists in status quo because we already have binding and non-binding ones, which one we should prefer. And we are telling you that the one with higher goals, which is better, is better.
Anything else? Go right ahead.
For the affirmative, if a binding enforcement mechanism was triggered and punishment was meted out, what would stop the violators from simply dropping out of the process?
So we would say, and this is kind of anticipating the Kyoto arguments that they're going to, I'm sure, make in their rebuttal or their final speech. We would say that, first of all, at the end of the day, we would contend that most countries wouldn't drop out if they failed to meet their targets, just because the cost of perceptually walking away from the table because you failed to meet your goal is a lot greater than whatever the cost of the compliance mechanism in the first place was. But second of all, and more importantly, we would say at the end of the day, if a country is willing to walk away from the table when they're not going to meet their agreements, there was no chance they would be an effective party in the first place. This goes back to what I was saying earlier. There's a middle ground of countries who we are helping, and all of the other countries, the countries who are going to comply anyway, anyways, and the countries who were definitely not going to comply anyways, those exist beyond both sides of this debate. It's about like getting those people in the middle who are participating but not complying right now to comply, because we think we can get them to do so.
And for the negative, would you have the same argument against binding enforcement mechanisms if what was at stake was not punishment but incentives? If there were incentives in a treaty that rewarded compliance and that a failure to comply eliminated those incentives but did not include punishment, would your argument still stand?
We contend that our argument would stand just the same, because yes, these incentives would induce some countries to enter the agreement and to stay in it, but we must crucially recognize that these incentives have to be paid by someone. And this someone would be much less likely to enter an agreement where they have to pay a huge amount of money to other countries than a one where they don't. And yet, even if all of this were not true, we tell you that we can have these positive mechanisms on our side as well. Just as we had in the Paris Agreement with the Green Climate Fund. Yet on our side, it is voluntary, so it helps developing countries with the implementation costs, yet it does not deter participation of developed countries.
I think we should hear the long-anticipated rebuttals, if that's all right with everybody. If anyone else has a burning question they need to ask, we're happy to extend this. We're fine on time. If not, we will hear the rebuttal from the negative team for 5 minutes, followed by, immediately followed by the affirmative rebuttal for 5 minutes, and that will conclude the debate. Okay? The negative team's rebuttal for 5 minutes.
Nothing is perfect in this world. We don't get a free lunch on either side of the house today. So this debate is crucially about comparing these two sides and about which one achieves more emission reductions through either having better compliance or better participation. So I'm going to compare these two sides in my speech, firstly talking about participation and secondly about compliance. So in participation, they told us that they would somehow just impose these binding mechanisms onto countries. Yet we have established over and over that this is not the case, and countries would have to consent to these enforcement mechanisms, would have to sign and ratify these treaties, because we are trying to save this planet and not the world of magic wands. And they never showed us why in this real world they would get the participation of countries. Whereas we explained to you that binding enforcement mechanisms actually deter participation because of the losses of sovereignty and because of economic losses. We also showed you that the most important countries for today's debate, which is the United States and China, would not join binding accords. Yet it is crucial to achieve participation, as no compliance can ever take place without countries participating in the first place. We gave you the example of the Basel Convention, and they told you that the loss of participation was caused by the legally binding status of the agreement, not by enforcement. It is somehow not. This is obviously not true, because what really matters for countries is how much they will have to pay and how much sovereignty they will lose, not whether the agreement is binding on paper. So it is binding enforcement mechanisms that actually deter participation. As to the unique benefits of either participation or compliance, we told you that participation is great because it leads to media attention and it raises awareness about the problem of climate change, leading to more solvency in the long run on national and international levels as well. We tell you that without participation, there can be no unique benefits in the affirmative world, because we are hardly going to strengthen our human rights enforcement or anything else in this world if we have 30 countries in an accord, however strong their compliance with it is. So for all these reasons, we win on the clash of participation, which is crucial for this debate, as no compliance can ever happen without it. Now, moving on to compliance. What we established in this debate is that our compliance is sufficient. We gave you the peer pressure of the international community, where we explained to you that countries will push others to stay compliant with the accord and to fulfill their goals. What we also gave you is domestic pressure by NGOs and citizens who care about climate change and who will ensure that even with withdrawals, this will not lead to a catastrophe, because local governments, cities and companies will stay within the accord, as was the case in the United States after its withdrawal. Now, they never gave you evidence that binding enforcement mechanisms actually work and actually actually help with participation. Whereas we gave you a comparison of the Kyoto and the Paris agreements and concluded that Paris is better. Yet even if we take them at their very best, even if we admit that compliance is better on their side, as I have already explained to you, no compliance can happen without participation. The loss of compliance on our side is at their very best marginal, because we have international and domestic pressure. The loss of participation on their side is immense, because countries will not sign on due to economic reasons and due to sovereignty. They try to claim that we will have no compliance whatsoever on our side, using the word zero many times. Yet this is a strawman fallacy, because instead of responding to our arguments about why we will actually have compliance on our side and why we will have sufficient compliance, they simply claim that we have none. So I will be crystal clear here. We have sufficient compliance on our side. Yet even if we did not, and even if their compliance was higher, we still win on the comparative, because we have far more countries participating and trying to do something. Now, moving on to the second part of compliance, which is the goals that are actually to be complied with. When I am entering an agreement, where I know that if I fail, I will be severely punished by other countries, I will naturally have an incentive to set the goal as low as possible, which is something they admitted. So we can see that the goals of accords that are actually to be fulfilled, the emission reductions, are far more stringent on our side. That means that even the overall contributions made by individual states are much higher on our side, because even if they fulfill only a part of what they set as their goal, it is still much more than the lowest possible bar they set on their side, which they will always pass. So, ladies and gentlemen, we achieve overwhelmingly better participation, we achieve sufficient compliance, and we have the empirical part of this debate on our side. Because nothing is perfect, but we mitigate climate change better than the affirmative vote negative.
Okay. Affirmative?
Everybody ready? All right, let's start off on the issue of participation. This is the number one, and in fact, probably the only offense they derive out of the round. Here's why they're not winning there. First of all, they tell you that their link to participation is that the United States and China, key players, are not going to participate in our world. Here's why this is fundamentally problematic. In doing so, they concede that the only way a climate change possibility or climate change accord is efficable is if, as they claim, both the United States and China participate. In the status quo, where we do not have binding enforcement mechanisms, the United States already is not participating. They fail the singular fundamental burden that they place on themselves and on the affirmative in the first speech of the entire round. This is problematic because at the very least we have a risk of the United States joining and a risk of China joining, but it's not just a risk, it is actually probable, and that comes down to compliance and incentive measurements. This is where the round gets really, really important. This is why the dropped warrants on our side of the flow are going to win us the round. We give you a bunch of different reasons why countries are incentivized uniquely in the affirmative world that they are not in the negative world. The number one example of this, as this links together participation and compliance, is the idea of hard incentives, something that the negative fails to respond to on a fundamental level. Here's what we tell you. In the status quo, all of their compliance comes from soft mechanisms. It comes from perception. It comes from peer pressure. Here's what we tell you. First of all, we turn these soft incentives against them. We say that in the status quo, you might look pretty bad if you sign an agreement and you don't go through with it. Where you look really bad is if you sign an agreement and now there are consequences and it's easier to follow the agreement and you still don't do it. Whatever peer pressure exists in their world not only also exists in our world, it gets even higher in our world. So the issue of soft incentives, which is their compliance, washes if not going to our way. But the issue of hard incentives uniquely flows our way because in their world, they have no tangible impact, not one, not a singular one, of not complying with the courts. That's why compliance doesn't happen. Here's why that gets really important on a weighing scale. Because they tell you to vote for them because in the status quo, they have some level of participation, whereas we'll get some level of compliance. Time and again, we've explained throughout this round that participation without compliance is meaningless. Here you get two very different contrasting analyses. Let's weigh the two of them. What they are telling you is that participation is a prerequisite to compliance. What we are telling you is that without compliance, participation is meaningless. Here's why you prefer our narrative more. First of all, because we'd argue that it's highly unlikely that literally every country tomorrow says, well, we're done. We're walking away from the table. In fact, Otne explains in rebuttal two key reasons why countries are unlikely to walk away from the table, unlikely to just say, well, we're done participating. First of all, he tells you that the main and most important reason is because the fundamental calculus of a country leaving an accord is different from it not joining one. When you've already sunk time, when you've already sunk resources into building an accord, we'd argue that it's pretty unlikely that you walk away. But lastly, they say that they give you the quantitatives, they give you the empirics. Here's why you don't buy them. First of all, their quantitatives, their empirics, the two accords they talk about are legally binding. That means that they signed the paper, you have an obligation. That does not mean it includes a binding enforcement mechanism. What a binding enforcement mechanism does is now when you've signed the paper, you are bound with consequences to follow through. That's going to be really important because legally binding accords, and this is really important, exist in both worlds. Both worlds have legally binding accords. Both worlds have countries signing pieces of paper. What our world does is it adds a binding enforcement mechanism at the point where their empirical analysis on the idea of binding enforcement mechanisms is really on something that exists in both worlds. They're not gaining unique participation impacts, but furthermore, we'd argue that on the issue of participation in relation to compliance, once you have incentives, you are far more likely to participate than the other way around. But lastly, they say that they're going for the idea of like the media coverage and they're going to make people more aware of the problem. This is where the bottom of our constructive comes into play. They just don't interact with this throughout the entire debate. We engage with it in cross, we go after it in constructive. Here's where it gets really key. We say, first of all, when you have enforcement mechanisms, just the idea of enforcement, even if we don't impact participation, even if we don't impact compliance, when you have enforcement, it creates a normative community. It sends a signal that we as a global community, as a geopolitical sphere, are all on the same page. That is very, very important because when we're on the same page, media attention, coverage, all these things increase, but they increase in a specific way. Now it's not just more media is covering. That might not necessarily be a good thing. For example, right-wing media could propagate ideas that climate change doesn't exist. That's still more media coverage. That's their link. What our link into coverage is specifically that we have more and more countries participating in coverage and knowledge that acknowledges the fact that climate change is anthropogenic. That's going to be absolutely key because the first step towards solving climate change is a global consensus on the idea that climate change is happening, climate change is our fault, and climate change must be solved by us. But secondly, more importantly, they also don't respond to the second Yang analysis at the bottom of the constructive. This is also absolutely crucial because what the second Yang analysis tells you is that when we have enforcement mechanisms on climate accords in the status quo, that also creates a triggering mechanism in which we have more enforcement, more compliance with all sorts of international treaties. Here's why that's going to be the most important impact in the round. Because on a weighing level, like I said before, the odds that either of us solve climate change in the round are slim. We're going to say that it goes our way, but it's pretty slim. The odds and the fact that the most probable impact that's bad to humanity in the next couple of years is human rights violations, improbable sanctions, and things of the types that happen when countries don't follow international law. Make them follow the international law. You have to vote for us. Thank you.
Thank you to the teams. Thank you to the panel. I believe Andrea has a few things to tell us now.
Well, also a big thank you to Mr. David Baker, to our esteemed judges, and our amazing students. The IPPF World Champion will be named 1 hour from now after the reception. The IPPF Champion takes home a $10,000 grand prize and the Brewer Cup. For now, we are adjourned, and I invite you all to join us across the hall for the reception. Now to our final two teams. At 3:30 p.m. today, William Mason High School and Leaf Academy competed in a final 2-hour debate here at the Harold Pratt House. At this time, we would like to go ahead and welcome William Mason and Leaf Academy to please come forward before we announce the results of that debate. Now, before we announce the results, I'd like to note that our runner-up will receive $3,500 for their school's debate program, while our IPPF World Champion will receive $10,000, which is divided between their school's debate program and individual scholarships. Now first, can we please give these students a big round of applause? On behalf of the Brewer Foundation and New York University, I am proud to announce that the winner of the 2017-18 International Public Policy Forum is Leaf Academy. like to go ahead and let's have our runners-up, William Mason, take a photo with Mr. Brewer and Mr. Sexton. And you'll also receive this trophy.
Great job.
And now Leaf Academy, one of only a few international winners so far in the history of the IPPF. So very exciting to come back up to the stage after they hug. Congratulations to all of our Elite 8 schools and to our new IPPF World Champion Leaf Academy. A quick note before we end the evening, we have already selected the topic for the 2018-19 competition. We hope to see all of you here again next year. The topic will be Resolved. U.S. abdication of international leadership creates dangerous global instability. There's more information on our website, so please check it out. And with that, we're adjourned.